advertisement, because I'm very pleased with these shirts that we now have. And Robert was instrumental in making these happen. So this is actually a pattern that shows what it looks like for interbeing to happen, how we create ourself, and then how we engage with others. And there is an article on the website for that under Living Systems. And we have a shop where you too can get a t-shirt just like this in the Gaia Shop of Knowledge. So I encourage people to take advantage of that. It helps us, and I hope it'll help you as well. It's been really fun to think about this and to see this. I think there's just a lot of learning that we can have when we understand how things come together. I was asked today to do a talk on personality, and I'm thinking, personality, what a shallow subject, because it's not really who we are. We are this interbeing. We are all these connections, and our current way of being in society doesn't allow us to really talk that. So we create the shell of a personality, of way of interacting, and we figure that's we get hooked into thinking that's us instead of understanding all the rest of it. Okay, so she's in the Mighty Network.
The individualism of modern culture.
That is public.
Catherine, I had trouble getting in. It took me 3 times. I don't know whether that's the issue was here on my side or somewhere.
What link were you using?
The one directly from the calendar.
Oh, okay.
In other words, I got the opening box 2 times, and then the whole operation froze. And then finally, the 3rd time, it came right through.
Okay, that's something for me to talk to them about. I didn't have any problem, and I go in that way too, just for that reason, because sometimes there's a disconnect between the schedule and my Zoom. So I've had that happen, so that I don't have 2 meetings. I always go in through the network so that we're all on the same page. So, Michelle, tell us a little bit about you and your company, and then I got some questions for you.
Sure. So my name is Michelle Smith. I'm a co-founder and a member and a consultant and facilitator with my business. It's called Circle Forward, and I have a business partner named Tracy Kunkler, and we've been in business together for about it's like over 10 years now that we've been. I think it's coming up on about 12 years since like we really started. And so Circle Forward is a firm where we equip network leaders and networked organizations with we support them to co-design and integrate systems of consent-based collaborative governance that are fit for their purpose. And so we help them with the skills, the tools, the practices, consulting, encouragement. Sometimes
Where are you based?
I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina, and Tracy used to live here. Now she lives a little bit west in Cullowhee. We have partner members. We also are a networked organization, so we network and partner with other folks who are offering other pieces of collaborative governance or of culture design and network design. So people in DC, people in Winston-Salem. We work all over the nation. We work internationally, if you count Canada and England so far.
Very good.
Actually, in Belize, we're doing a volunteer project with some other collaborators, co-conspirators in Belize.
Nice. So what got you into governance? Why governance?
Sociocracy got me into governance. And
Okay.
what got me into sociocracy and what got me into sociocracy was a final sort of discouragement after I worked in nonprofit organizations, working on different areas of different issue areas. I was a fundraiser working in a number of different issue areas that I felt passionate about, and I felt really that I cared about a lot. And I just kept seeing the culture inside the organizations. It seemed to me to be just as toxic as any corporate culture could be, or any other, organizational culture could be. And I was kind of in despair. I was also in despair of actually creating the kind of change that we need to change at all the different levels. So this was probably about 12 years ago that, and then, 2009, I got laid off from my job, like a lot of people did during the 2009 crash. So got laid off and was really working, focusing, and had been like focusing on permaculture, learning about permaculture, learning about urban agriculture, starting to think like where I need to put my energies is in the place where I live, and learning about these systems. And permaculture was really inspiring to me and really shifted my thinking and really matched the thinking that I had been coming to, this idea of a systemic shift. I didn't have that language yet of systems change, but I could sense into it. And from working locally in a food system policy, like sort of volunteering and being part of a local effort to create a local food policy council and recommendations for food policy for Asheville and Macomb County, got on a mailing list and got invited to a training where John Buck and, at the time, Tracy Kunkler were leading this training. And at the time, they were calling it dynamic governance because sociocracy was really still a barrier in the US. It sounds too much like socialism. People get crazy, so they were calling it dynamic governance. But if you ever see dynamic governance, that is sociocracy in the US. And now that's being used less and less. And when I went to that training, I just had this big aha, like this is what we've been looking for. It made sense to me the way permaculture made sense to me. It's like, this is almost like permaculture for organizations. It's they're design principles. There are some techniques that work in a lot of different places that you can use again and again, but it's not a system of techniques. It's a system of principles that can work at any level. So that really inspired me. And I said to John and Tracy, I want to figure out some way to help expand this work bigger, because this is really, and what I know now, the way I would say that now is governance is a key leverage point for systems change. That I was just sort of at that time intuiting it. So that's how I got into it. And I want to say that Circle Forward has roots in sociocracy, but has actually expanded outside of classical sociocracy in our work, particularly with networks. We can talk about why that's a little bit different, but I just want to.
Well, and you also mentioned principles of sociocracy. Yeah. So are there a couple that you want to enumerate that you think are particularly significant?
Well, there's what sociocracy would say would be their principles, and I'm not deep into that world anymore as much as actually coming back into it. I love Sociocracy for All and recommend people check that out, and Sociocracy 3.0 as well. So what we've derived and distilled, and there's even a page on our website called the consent principle. And the consent principle says, and the consent principle says that I won't move forward when I'm outside my range of tolerance. and I won't force you to move forward and the group won't force you to move forward when you're outside your range of tolerance. And if you have that objection, you feel, that you're outside your range of tolerance, the group owns it. It belongs to all of us. It's not just your problem to solve, because you're holding wisdom. That objection is holding treasure. You have a perspective that the reason we come together and the reason we have inclusiveness is because everybody has blind spots, and we need to be able to see, the whole system needs to be able to see each other. So that notion that we're not going to force anybody, any member, to live or move forward outside their range of tolerance. There's also a co-responsibility there of, I have a responsibility to offer my objection, to share my objection. The group has a responsibility to then own that, and we move forward and adapt together.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
Like that.
And then sociocracy would also say double linking as a principle, but that's one of the places with networks that we really don't use double linking a lot. We can talk about why, but what is a principle is that objections can't be ignored. Like somehow there has to be within the structure and in the, within the organizational structure, a way that particularly voices who are right out, that the voices at any level of functionality in the organization, whether they're really frontline or much more, 30,000 foot in scope, no voices can be ignored by the rest of the system.
That's one of the real big weaknesses of voting, is that the wisdom in the system where those people who didn't agree gets dismissed and is no longer available. Actually, I mean, they don't count anymore.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing the effects of that now, where people feel really frustrated about that because they feel they have something to say and there's no place to put it. You voted, you're gone. So
it's winner take all.
Yeah. And that's not appropriate. And it's really a weaker way of being, because the strength comes from having a whole system in agreement, which only happens if you hear the dissenting voices and address those issues.
And agreement is not a final state. It's not a static state. It's moving forward. It's it's systems level. It's adapting, responding, because you can have an agreement and then something can change, and now that agreement needs to be adapted. So you have a system in place for responding. What's that?
That's interbeing. That's exactly what that is.
Interbeing,
it's
right?
Back and forth until you come into agreement and it fits and it works for everybody. Yeah.
Until it doesn't, and then you have to adapt, because that other real principle, one of the principles is, accept feedback. It's one of the ones that matches permaculture. Accept feedback and be willing to change. Yeah. Everything's an experiment. So sociocracy felt appealing to me because it was inclusive, and it was adaptive, and it was like coming up with policy direction that made sense, and that didn't just blindly go off and do things that were going to create breakdown.
Very nice. I like that. Are there issues when you're working with different companies that over time you can see keep reoccurring in companies that are exploring this?
Yes. And, we again work mostly with networks. So networks are multi-sector and multi-stakeholder. So there'll be businesses. So in a network, there will be municipal, there'll be public health, state, often just a lot of different stakeholders. There'll be nonprofit, for-profit, government, and individuals, residents, businesses. So it could be whoever's working on any particular, trying to move the needle on any particular thing is, and shares the purpose as part of the network. So but often we do work with organizations and businesses. So what are the things that come up? One of the things that comes up is it's really hard for people to understand, to really feel, to trust that consent as a basis for decision making can, that there's not going to be the fear is always, what about when you can't get that one person to consent, right? And so it's really hard to believe that when you're really working on that level of what an objection really is, like the risk that we can't afford to take, when you're really working on that level and you're not trying to persuade people out of their objections, but what you're trying to do is adapt to that objection, find out what is really the risk, and then what can we do to make it safe enough, and understand that everything's an experiment. So we're always going to be able to have a way to review that and evaluate that, that's safe, that's really safe. Also, and this is just with the decision-making piece, with the consent piece. There's also something that comes up again a lot is understanding that we don't all have to be in the same room at the same time to have inclusive decision making. And yes, you can actually delegate, authorize someone so that there's more efficiency. You can authorize a person to make decisions within a framework that's been consented upon, and that you want to set those things up kind of early. And you may want to go back and make sure those things are in place if you're trying to move forward a little faster. That's with just the decision making. Otherwise, it's figuring out how we're gonna organize ourselves. If you're in a network, it's not, it's like, what is our structure going to look like? There's just we call it the eight spheres of network governance design, and I think they apply to just about anybody. There, these are the areas that really are governance, and that they all connect to each other and touch each other. They're almost like gears, if you turn one, it starts to turn the others. I might think of some other things in a minute.
Okay. Well, I want to go back a little bit because I'm just curious. You said that the fear is that one person will not agree or will not play the game or will be obstreperous. How often does that happen?
I think the real fear is that we're going to get bogged down and not be able to move forward,
right,
and not be able to meet our mission. And that, this idea, that's kind of the deeper fear. Ask me that question again, though, would you please?
So how often does that happen? Because I know we're afraid of it, but in real time, does that happen often?
Yeah. I mean, what happens is folks often mistake preferences for objections or traditions for objections. And they may even mistake triggers, feeling triggered for having an objection. So, this is one of the reasons we're always like, it really helps to have a coach while you're moving through this. But doesn't even organizations that we were coaching, like things come up, particularly around communities of color, right, where they've been living outside their range of tolerance and forced to live without any voice and living out for so long that it's hard to sift through sometimes. So that's a lot of things that happen is when and the other thing, that happens is we're really used to debating and defending, right? Instead of, and and making other people defend, right? Rather than getting curious, asking more questions. What's the real, what's the risk that we can't afford to take here? What's the risk that you're seeing? And what's the risk that you're sensing? And then letting that solution or that adaptation emerge, which you don't know what it's going to be and you don't know who it's going to come from. Knowing what a proposal is and what its purpose is. A proposal can be informal and it can be formal and written depending on the context of where it's coming up. But its purpose is not to get it passed. Not solely. You know, its purpose, part of its purpose is to surface objections, is to see, you know, what are we missing? What are we, you know, what proposal shape maker or us team who's putting together a proposal, what are we not seeing? So we get, and that urgency, you know, we get that urgency. Another thing I think that organizations and networks all have in common so much is that they incentivize and evaluate performance based on the outcomes, which is important, but they're not also, if they're, you know, if you've authorized a person to, you know, to be the point person or be the leader or be the, you know, main decision maker within this realm, and you've authorized them. And in that authorization is the agreement that I, the authorized person, am going to be in integrity with the principle of consent, meaning I'm actually going to go and check with the impacted parties. I'm not going to check a box. I'm actually going to go and say, do you see any risks we can't afford to take here? Do you have any preferences? Do you have any advice? Do that advice process, but really, really that being in integrity to that, like evaluating on that, right? Making that visible is something that I think we don't, you know, and that's how governance work. Like that's at the level of governance, and it's at the level of governance, whatever level of team or the network you're on. You know, that's what self-governing is that it's happening at every level.
Now, the traditional verbiage for that would be accountability.
Okay.
But I hear that it's actually a little deeper than that.
Well, it's just what you're going to be accountable for. How are we going to hold someone accountable for making sure that, how are we going to know that you are really meeting that principle of consent, that you really are not ignoring risk? How are you going to know how, you know, and it's really going to be that the people that you're interacting with, the people that you're experts, as well as, you know, anybody impacted or affected, are going to be able to say, yeah, my objection was heard. Those proposals were adapted. And, you know, the breakdown that could have occurred didn't. Well, we don't, it's hard to measure like what didn't happen, right? But those are the kind of creative thinking that, you know, that take time.
Well, I'm hearing reflection on the process is what I'm hearing.
Reflection on process is yeah. And but building, not forgetting to build that in. And then I lost a little, had a thought, but I'm going to pause and then I'll come back to it if it comes.
So if an organization or firm wants to go in this direction, are there things they should think about prior to actually getting their feet in the water that they could do to prepare for this, to make it an easier implementation?
Yeah, I think they could. Boy, this is a good question. I'm just, you know, kind of spitballing right here. Well, you know, they can do some research, right? So first of all, they can go and have a team. Like the first thing I probably would recommend is that they create a circle for this transition. for this, who's going to help create a plan, who's going to do some research, bring back information, so that,
And
is
practice is what I'm hearing too, in that,
Well-
that is a sort of a small experiment in a way about.
they could start practicing. I think, a small group who's going to start, they could start practicing, so they could take some workshops like the ones we offer. They could take some workshops, ask some questions, they could get some coaching. And then it's also then, start to identify the folks, what's the next right circle, right? The thing that I think was a problem 10 years ago, and it's changed since, is it was kind of like governance in a box. This was sort of for me, the problem with sociocracy at the time. And again, I think it's evolved, and I love sociocracy and tons of, like, it's family, right? But it was and holocracy too. It was like governance in a box. We're going to bring you this whole thing, we're going to set it down, and then we're going to fit you into it, rather than like letting it emerge with some purpose and direction around, we want to be inclusive of all voices because we think that's the smart thing to do. We want to transition towards this more towards self-governance, because we think that's the most resilient and regenerative way to do our work together. So we're gonna do it in a regenerative, resilient way. We're not going to do governance in a box, right? Where some benevolent dictator who doesn't want to be a benevolent dictator anymore is like, my last act of benevolent dictatorship is that we're going to do sociocracy. Like that falls. And one of the reasons it falls, I tell you what happened more than once. One of the reasons it falls is because that leader has the power to tip the boat over themselves more than anyone. And when they get uncomfortable and they get scared, they have the power to tip the boat over, whereas nobody else really does. The other people can just withdraw, leave, quit, sabotage, sandbag, whatever. That leader, that person who's at the top of that pyramid, really does have the power. And I've seen that happen more than once.
So what I'm hearing in that, because I've seen this in the work that I've done as well, is that when you talk about, this is 20 years ago, empowering people, everybody's for it, it's a wonderful thing, until they discover that means that their power has to match. They have to accede to the power of others, that it's about a co-powering. And they feel like they've lost something, that kind of control that they're used to. So there's a real fear about that. And I used to tell people that you don't do this if you're not willing to give up the power you think you have and discover the power that's real.
That's a way to say it. I always say I would never ask anybody to give up power.
Right.
I would ask you to share, like, not share, but like powers like happiness. Like the more happiness I give away, the more happiness I have. But it does mean that you're giving up some control.
Yeah.
And it does mean that not just your ideas are going to be the ones.
Right. Right.
Done. Like it's not Jean-Luc Picard world anymore.
Yep.
And so we're both, I agree. And it can be really scary. So I would more say to them, make sure they have some support there, for that, because they're holding a ton of responsibility. They're holding a ton of responsibility and a ton of wisdom and a ton of expertise and a ton of experience. So it's, there's no 10 quick steps. It's just not, that's not a thing. It's and you almost, like, it's transformative, and in transformative things, there comes a moment where it's just like, I don't know how this is going to work out at all. I don't have the slightest notion how we're going to do this, how this is going to work. And then when it's clear what when the purpose is shared and the blind spots aren't there, and you have as much folks talking about, what's the risk we can't afford to take. And it's okay to try things. It's like, oh, we're just going to, it's great. Like there's a very simplified version of consent in decision-making, which is, I have a proposal, there are no objections, we try it. That has to be unpacked to what's a proposal, what's an objection, and how do we know it worked? There you get our culture of consent, as opposed to just a decision-making method. But really, when it can be like, sure, how do we let people try things? How do we give them budget power and an ability to know, like, not go off the rails, and to come back? How do we build that in? And that means, and that does mean building in reflection, self-reflection, evidence, and learning, which is, again, time.
So I'm actually hearing that there are, I'm actually, my mind went to a brochure of really kind of framing the reframing of power and what that looks like, the sharing of purpose, understanding some of these things like objections and proposals and how they're different and how we can get trapped. That understanding some of that stuff, if you can do that beforehand, is really helpful. And if you can't, you have to be prepared to do that while you're doing this anyway, because it's a consistent thing. We're like onions, we can get it one time and it changes and we're in a whole new space, even though it's very similar. It's such an interesting thing about us. But because I'm just thinking it's such a big step to go from somebody on top to a bunch of people who kind of share that responsibility, and then have other people who are sharing different responsibilities and then co-creating amongst them all. That's a really big change. And,
oh yeah, it is a big change.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about transforming a hierarchy, then sociocracy is the game, is your, is what I would recommend. Networks are not hierarchies, so they're naturally not, they're all volunteer. Nobody has to be there, nobody's the boss of anybody else. People are just there because everybody's needed if we're going to move the needle on this issue, right? Or if we're going to, even if it's a network of sustainability directors in cities, like there's a network of like that, even that kind of network that's more of the sort of the business or function role, network, or a social impact network. Nobody's the boss of anybody else. Nobody has to be, but you need everybody there to make the network really work. That's different than a traditional, even a nonprofit or a business. If you're transforming a hierarchy, I recommend sociocracy. And the thing that I see most in that is that people don't really do the double linking.
Yeah.
They don't do it the sociocratic way. They try to adapt it a little bit, and
so talk about double linking, what that is and why that's important.
Okay, so double linking, it's a method, it's a structure for creating the culture, creating the organization such that no voice can be ignored, objections can't be ignored. And the idea is that, so you have your hierarchy, maybe your board, and then your general circle, and then functional circles, and then maybe even functional circles off of that. And the double link is that from the circle above, there's a voice that comes down to the next circle. that's chosen by selected by consent of that circle. And then the next circle, so there's a person who goes down and they're selected up here, and there's a person who goes up to that next circle and they're selected, and they're the representative who goes up is accountable to the circle that elected them, right? So that way you have the perspective of the circle above who's holding a bigger perspective. And theoretically, someone who, let's use a restaurant as an example. Theoretically, a dishwasher could be on the general circle because that person's just getting elected up and up. So that, you know what I mean? So that, but in any case, that general circle is not making decisions that affect the dishwasher without the perspective of the whole dish team. Somehow that, that's getting that voice, that perspective in decisions that affect them. There's a voice for them. Marketing decides we're going to start having tea service, fancy tea service, and we're using, the most beautiful pots, and suddenly all the tea service dishes are getting broken and we don't know why. This is, well, maybe you should ask the dishwashers who are saying our system down here doesn't accommodate those teapots. That I don't know if that metaphor really works, but my point, like
Yeah.
if it affects me, nothing about us without us. That was the slogan of the disabilities movement, and it's really throughout, equity. It's not just to be nice. It's like things work better when
Right.
those voices are there. So that's the double linking method. And it was invented pre-internet. So there were a lot of meetings, it does require, people are going to a lot of meetings, operational meetings, like in addition to like just the regular operational meeting, there's governance meetings, there's circle meetings about things, particularly at first, right? So people, especially small organizations, they're like too many meetings and all the circles and la la la. So that's something to be figured out. But and what happens a lot of time is there's no one who's carrying the fuller scope out to the more functional circles, and therefore the functional circles don't have a way to connect across to each other, and they get isolated.
Yeah, I'm really starting to see that because our church is playing with this. And it's also true that people don't understand their role in double linking. And if we have like 5 people in a circle, then the double linking seems like too much work. We don't have 2 people to do that. We can do 1 person, but not 2. But 1 person can't carry both of those. And you get involved in the meeting and you forget your obligation. You're just there, you're not bringing in that voice. So there's I think a lot of training around that. It's not something you can just say, you now are a link and expect it to happen, because people don't.
And nobody should ever be elected a link unless they're very, very clear on their role and their, and their purpose in their role. And all of that, it's like front loading, as it takes some time to front load these things. And then, you'll be continuing, but it's true.
So if an organization goes to all the trouble to do this, what do they get out of it? Why would they do this?
Well, one of the things in terms of the consent principle, in terms of consent, and I think, and I'm not a business, MBA or anything like that, but what I understand to be true and believe to be true is that things move at the speed of trust. And the higher the level of trust, the more productivity you get, the more creativity you get, the more momentum towards your purpose is possible. And the less trust you have, the longer it takes. It's one of the reasons it takes a little longer in the front, because trust is built one decision at a time. It is not built, you said it beautifully in our collab call. Without experience, it's just blind faith. And that's not creating productivity, right? Trust is built, and trust is built one decision at a time. My objection was adapted to. I saw a risk, and the plan changed. To whatever degree. It changed to 2 weeks later instead of 2 weeks sooner. It changed to whatever, right? Like nobody, it was
me.
I was not only heard, but I had influence. I had power.
Yeah.
In a decision that affected me and my work and my role and my, team's ability to fulfill our role. So when you have trust, things can move really fast. Creativity can really happen. You can say, if it's a business, all right, folks, we've got this. We've got a potential to make a bunch of money. If we can get these out there, and we also have a commitment to, employee well-being and environmental care and whatever. So y'all know best about what's going on. I mean, this is the basic, what's that? The Toyota, the Toyota manufacturing that was such a change where, folks on the line had a lot of power. Right. So it's cool. Sociocracy didn't come out of nowhere. Like it's a synthesis of things, including systems theory and complexity theory, right? But anyway, my point being that when you can trust the folks, when there's that level of trust, all that stuff happens more quickly. I imagine you would have less turnover. I'm given to understand that in the Netherlands, this was certainly true a while back. I bet it's still true. Where in the Netherlands, everybody's got to be in a union. All workers just about are in a union, unless you work in a company that's sociocratically governed, and then you don't. Because they know that there's a process, there's a system, there's a mechanism for including people's voices in the decisions that affect them, and for including what their pay is going to be, what their benefits are going to be, and then those decisions are being made with transparency, like folks can see where my salary fits into the whole picture of keeping this company in a resilient and flourishing state.
Yeah, there's such a fear about that. It's so interesting that we somehow don't trust that people would care that it makes a difference. And I know between union and management, it's like, oh, well, this will be true. Well, okay, so I need to see how that's true. I mean, it's nice for you to say it, but it helps me to see how it actually happens. And just telling me that it's true, it does not do anything for my...
Telling me that it's true that we care.
Or that it's going to have an impact. Oh, if we raise salaries, it's going to... How do we know that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice for you to say, I'm sure there's an impact. I want to see that. And in seeing that, new opportunities can come up because people see things differently. There was a company years ago that totally opened their books. So it was called Open Book Management, in fact. And they taught all of their employees how to read balance sheets and how to do all that kind of stuff. And then people go, oh, they have insights. They can see things because they come from a different perspective than the person who's educated in that can often see, because they're not on the ground. They're not understanding the ramifications in the same kind of way. So it's incredibly vital. Yes, it takes time. And yes, you got to educate people. I mean, you can't just assume if you shove the information at them, they're going to get it.
That's
But
not transparency.
right. But when you take that time,
Mhm.
then you get the benefit of the group wisdom, which is what we're after in sociocracy and dynamic governance. We're trying to raise the wisdom that's in the system to make it available. And,
Right.
and that doesn't reside in one person's head, it's everybody's head together.
Yep. John Buck, who is the person who brought sociocracy to the English speaking world with his book, We the People, Consenting to a Deeper Democracy. I recommend anybody go get it, read it. He just co-wrote that book too, but he also co-wrote another book, and it's called Bossa Nova, B-O-S-S-A, and the B-O-S-S-A stand for things like, I can't remember all of them, but it's like, what is it? Participatory budgeting, which is like open book management, participatory budgeting, sociocracy, agile, and sort of showing like how these can all be, how, working together, putting them all together. So if you're in that business world, I want to recommend that. From a network standpoint, the work that I do with networks, so much of a social impact, of course, now, and really it's all our business, is equity. And so we have a hypothesis that consent, applying the principle of consent, the practices, practicing consent, we really think of it as practicing a principle, is how we operationalize equity. And that's the keystone. That's the keystone to making equity really work, is that we're not asking anybody to live outside their range of tolerance on decisions that affect them in their role. So when it's and that's a big lift, and so right now a lot of the work that we're doing, like a lot of the workshops that we have out there, are really aimed at, and we're keeping them, there's no set fee so that anybody can have access. People are invited to contribute whatever they're able, the amount that feels accessible, to keep the work going. But for right now, we're because we're really wanting to get feedback on how is this happening, how does this work amongst people of color? Are people of color really experiencing a difference when they're in a place where consent is the practice? And if not, why not? What about it is not working, is what needs to happen. Maybe it's not consent, maybe it's something else that needs to happen in teams we don't know, right? So we need to know, we need to find out, we need to understand. So
that leads into my question about, can you do consent without sociocracy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because sociocracy includes double linking, and also the it's sort of that engineering thing of that input, transformation, output. It's like, that's the thing. It's like people think of consent, who've been exposed to sociocracy, think of consent as that sociocratic decision-making model where you're going around, you're in a meeting and you do rounds, right? That's a method of decision-making that works great in that kind of meeting. But there's a lot of other ways that you can, and it might take more than one depending on what your context is. You might have to use surveys and meetings and phone calls and talks, and canvassing, whatever. I don't know. Like, it depends on what's going on to make sure you get, you're in integrity with that idea of you're not missing blind spots. You're not, your blind spots are not causing harm to people and keeping people out. So yeah. What does that answer the question?
Yeah, and I like that a lot because for me, what that does is if you really hang on to the principle that no decision is made without participation, then you can get creative with how that participation happens. And if you do that enough over time, you'll start to create structures to make that easy. So
Yeah.
you're developing the organization from the inside out instead of this imposition. Even the circle idea is kind of like nice, but do you have to have circles? It sounds like you don't really have to have circles. You just have to have those processes that allow you to gather the consent that you need for whatever it
Depends on
is.
what's going on and what it's about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I
that's a
mean,
whole different way of looking at it. It
yeah.
opens
And you
things
can,
up.
I mean, our name is Circle Forward. Like we're very committed to the circle because that's deeply indigenous in us. The
Yeah.
idea of, you know, we sit where we can see each other, you know, or we find a way to see each other and hear each other and hear the whole system. And, you know, and also that it's a cycle, right? And that there's growth, birth, and death, that there's, you know, that there's spirals, which is kind of circles, but, you know, we're moving up. We actually, our logo is actually a Taurus, which sort of is all those different ways a circle can be, you know, this way, this way, and this way, and this way. So so the circle is, you know, and happens in teams. I mean, occasionally people do work by themselves on their thing, but it's really teams. Well, do you want to call it a team? Do you want to call it a circle? You want to call it whatever? You need to be turning toward each other.
Yeah.
And then decisions don't happen, you know, I want to be a little more specific that decisions, I know what was the thing I wanted to say before, but like, who is affected? Who's going to be affected by this decision?
Yeah.
How do we get that perspective? If it doesn't affect you, it's like, you know, John Buck in Sociocracy says at the general circle meeting, at that meeting, if your thing's not on the agenda and you don't need to be there, you don't need to be there, but your seat's always there, right? There's no, you know, if it's not something, or you've already like had, you know, put your voice in there and there's trust that's going to be, then you don't have to be there. Okay. Here's the thing. The other thing that always comes up. The people who have positional power, the boss, the supervisor, or somebody who's got holding that responsibility, the people with positional power, also experts, are often afraid that using consent means that it's this thing of losing power, like that they're going to get overrun, right? Yeah. And there's a big risk there. So getting them to understand that nothing moves forward without your consent either. Like you're not giving up you're not giving up any power. You're not giving up your ability to speak your risk that you see, because everybody else might have that, like they have blind spots to what you can see too, right? So we don't ignore, you know, we don't ignore folks just because it's not, but we're so enculturated to voting and debating. It's just like we just assume it's all there is. It's the way you do things. It's just white people, you know, we just do like in white culture, right? And I mean, I don't know, I call it dominant culture because I don't know what's, you know, there's plenty of other empires out there that.
Yeah, industrialized, I have heard, is the term, which I really like because that speaks. I'm trying to get away from that name calling. Colonialization is, you know, finger pointing, who wants to be the colonial power, but industrialization, we all kind of want that. And so many countries have taken that on, and it's that mindset. It's the same mindset. So
that's a good one. I'm really a huge fan of David Corton. He's one of my teachers. He's you probably know, he's the original publisher of Yes Magazine, but he wrote When Corporations Rule the World, and he wrote the book that really I read first was the Great Turning.
Yeah.
And that really, like, that I kind of, all these things happened for me at the same time. And I was like, that empire culture, that's it. Because
Yep.
I started really thinking about this stuff a long time ago when my first work was in domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy and education, prevention education. I started really thinking about power and consent back then. And wondering, and then, but of course, always cared about, I was also cared a lot about the earth. And then of course I cared about racial equity, but it wasn't my primary, right? I cared about labor and worker and economic equity, but, I was really right there in that with earth and women, And then when I read David Korten, I was like, oh, right, that's empire culture.
Yeah.
All of these are different forms and ways of keeping the empire going. And he would put it next to, at the time he called it earth community, but now he calls it ecological civilization. So empire civilization versus, good to see you, Robert. Thanks for staying with us as long as you did.
Yeah.
Circleforward.us if you have any curiosity. I wanted to say and give to you, Catherine, something you can put in the description links, a link to some resources that we have for free on our website. And one is the decision-making protocol. So it kind of expands that consent decision-making process to a little more of a protocol. So it depends on what scope of decision you're making. So it'll work sort of at any scope. And then we also just created another little flow chart too, that's going to be going up. And then our network governance design canvas that shows these 8 spheres of network governance design, which I think may be useful to anyone.
And these are free resources, correct?
These are free on our website for the low price of your email. But if you don't want to put your email in there, if you just get in touch with me, I'll send it to you. It's no big deal. But these are just some tools that we have available for you, for folks who are thinking about it and wondering, just a different perspective from maybe classic sociocracy. And then, how we build our structure in a network, you start from where you are, and you start to think like, really sort of, where does it hurt? What do we need to solve first? And a lot of times that starts with some kind of a coordinating circle, steering circle. And those are the folks who are investing some time and energy into learning and also taking it out, finding out how we're going to co-design our governance structure, co-design our agreements, co-design.
One of the things that I found useful in the total quality movement, which dates me a good deal, Deming had a tool that allowed you in a meeting to say, who can say no to this? Who has no power? And sometimes it's in many places. Who's going to be impacted and who should know?
Yeah.
You can actually fill that out so that you connect with those people.
Yeah, that's a
Because
great
I don't think we understand that either. We just don't think about who else should know. I mean, I get to make a decision in this domain. All right, so I've made the decision. And then, oh, well, yeah, now so-and-so is going to have to change what they do. And so-and-so needs to know that so that they can add this piece. But you don't think about that. So how do you address that with the groups that you work with? How do you get them to begin to see the interconnections that are sometimes invisible? Especially, I would think in a network, it would be really confusing.
Sure. Well, in the protocol, that's one of the steps is who's impacted. Like that is to answer that question. Who's going to be impacted by this? And that's a piece of work, right? To figure it out. And I think that, I imagine that even, in organizations that use that tool, eventually you start to think that way, right? You
Right.
just start and you
But
remind
it's a
each
habit.
other, and you mess up, and then you
Yeah.
you get feedback, and then you're like, oh yeah, I forgot to do that. And then you
Yeah.
know, and then you and then you and then you learn, and you're a learning organization, and learning's okay, right? And the idea that mistakes, the judgment, punishment, reward, that's another piece of the empire culture,
Yeah.
and it keeps people from trusting and hiding. It keeps people hiding. It keeps people trusting, and and yeah. Anyway, I could go on, but I know we're coming.
What do you hope to have happen in the next 10 or 20 years in your field?
I would really love to see the principle of consent become really nomenclature. I would love to see people adopt, one of the main practices for consent decision making in a group, is to have someone who facilitates the conversation. I would like to see more and more people within, all kinds of at every level, who have a skill, who have an inclination and maybe a native talent for facilitation, to, have that nurtured to facilitate consent, to understand how to do that. I would love to see that be widely practiced. I just would love to see a whole, 20 years from now, I'd love to see a whole generation of people who, a lot of people who just grew up, with the practices of consent, and that's just sort of what they do. And it's not something that I think there's a lot of more and more, Gen Z, or they're just like, I'm not working like that. I'm not going to do that.
I just had a little insight too that I haven't really clarified before. I think there is this confusion when we think about decision making. We really think about the yes or no process. Yes, I will do it, or no, I won't. Instead of, let's see what works to make this happen, which is what I'm hearing consent as. We have a goal, a project, a direction, an idea, and let's explore how to make this work so that everybody's on board. That's really different. It really gets rid of that black and white yes or no, and that feeling of compulsion that comes with that.
Yeah.
That they're going to make me do, or we're going to do something that I just know is wrong, which we're so familiar with. We have those experiences, but this is very, very different.
It is different. And the idea that everything's an experiment is, until it's not, and then it moves over into the complicated realm, and you've got a process, and the process works and whatever, until it doesn't, then it's just an experiment that lasted longer, right? It's an experiment that led to some success, and we were able to use it, and then one day something happens, and there was a robot for that or whatever, and now we need to pull it back into this area of complexity where we're like, oh, we need to respond now, we need to adapt now. But in 10, 20 years, it would be just so cool to see, I would love to, I get pretty radical. So be very careful. Ask me what I want to see in 20 years. I want to see local, I want us to see self-governing communities that are linked throughout the globe, and that there are technologies as well as face-to-face ways of us really being able to make decisions and have power on the things that affect us at a local level, regional, national, and that we, are able to to have power in the ways that affect us. That's what I want. Because I think the house we're in is crumbling.
Yeah.
And I am over here trying to build the next house with a lot of, we're trying to build the next house.
Yep.
I'm not trying to burn this house down. Don't need to. And may even help patch it up a little bit here and there, just because I'm still living in this house. Right? I'm still living in this house, but I'm more and more spending time over here in this house. So that's
so this is a segue into my last question, which is,
okay.
We're in a polycrisis that has impacted every system that we have going. There is nothing that's functioning the way it should, and it's going to get worse for lots of reasons. How do you feel this type of governance contributes to addressing those issues?
Well, it can't ignore objections. It doesn't ignore and there's there's more there's real transparency. So and I'll even take that all the way to the bats object. If the bats are objecting to this decision, to this policy, to this practice, then then we need to adapt that policy and that practice. Because we're in trouble if we don't have the bats, the bees, the water. So how do we bring, the real question is, how do we bring in the other than human members of our system? But what was that question again? Ask me again, so because I got a little off track.
Well, how does this type of governance contribute to solving the incredible number of problems that we've got?
I definitely go back to that. If you can't ignore objections, then you adapt your policies and your solutions but here's the thing. You can't consent. It's very difficult to get consent if you don't have shared purpose. That's the very first piece. The reason Washington, the reason Washington and all of our local legislation in Western civilization is where it is because we got people who don't share purpose. Right? So I am not,
they do, and they don't know it.
They don't know it, or they, if I'm working on forest protection, I'm not going to bring in a paper company whose purpose is maximizing profits, unless they truly share the purpose of protecting at a landscape level this millions of acres of forest. They don't have any business in that circle, right? And so that's another piece. So there's the folks who share purpose. I would love to see us be just with I don't know. There's a withdrawal that I feel, and then there's of just not participating anymore in that. But that's we're in our culture, we're in it. So there's no,
I think even a paper company, what they really want is the ability to make paper, and understanding how a healthy forest help them make paper can create a shared purpose. But
unless you've got quarterly, unless your purpose is quarterly,
well, then you have to adjust all of that. But I mean, the end point is really, if you still want to keep making paper, how do you do that within this constraint? And then you have to unravel all the rest of it. So Peggy, you got a question or two.
Oh, well, first I want to say I'm celebrating, Michelle, your vision of facilitators everywhere, bringing sociocracy forward. It's just a vision that's so powerful, and stay with it and keep going with it. And Catherine, thank you for all your really mindful questions that you've been asking, that you seem to ask them as I'm thinking, it's just been really a wonderful experience in this call. The situation, so I have a powerful moment that just happened that I'm just, if we have time for a little
Sure.
story here, maybe Michelle could help me with this. So last night I was at a village meeting. So my little village of 4,000 wants to redo a big park on the other side of town, and I'm the river woman along the river on this side of town trying to get well, I've been doing river restoration for the last 3 years and really trying to get people to touch and experience the river and develop that park as a natural setting. And so I go to this meeting for this other park, and which has tons of one kind of sport throughout this. So it's very focused, but they want to take down 800-year-old oak trees to create a splash pad for kids, which I think is important, that there's some water experience for kids, because our what they did when all the energy moved off the river and our town was developing west, an organization put in a big park with a clay bottom dark pool, and lots of chemicals, and nobody wants to be lifeguards there anymore. Nobody wants to care for it. So now we have this enormous pond that needs to be filled in. And then on another part of the park, they want to clear cut these 100-year-old oak trees to put the splash pad there. And I was so disturbed coming home. I voiced my opinion, and then the mother next to me is saying, well, we don't want leaves in our splash pad. You know, my kids are going to be, that's just too much work to move the leaves out. But I'm like, the splash pad's closed before autumn leaves fall. So what are we talking about here, right? Like, there's no thinking, okay, we're all needing that empathy right now with our projects, right? But so how do I use this as an opportunity to educate? And they're trying to build a nonprofit called Friends of the Parks, which I'm about the river park. So that's why I showed up, and I'm trying to figure out what's the next step for me right now. Am I writing a letter to the editor of the paper? Am I going to the village trustees saying, you know, how did it get this far with clear cutting trees? I mean, that was a perspective that wasn't being considered, obviously, right? So I mean, these trees, I don't have to tell the two of you, these are the ancestors of our community that are host to so many, you know, the biodiversity, and they make the park really, they're really amazing trees, and they're right.
And what do you want a splash pad with no freaking shade? I mean,
right. And then they're like, well, we'll just put up some you know, aluminum poles with the tent like things. Well, my husband runs a splash pad in another community, and after 13 years of having that splash pad, they're replacing all that is disposable, and you know, it wears down, and
I know this is
you know, it requires maintenance to set it up and take it down. And we're a little village of 4,000. We don't have the street crew to set it up and take it down. So that's just another more work for our street crew. You know, I mean, the point being,
has the street crew been brought into this conversation?
Well, and that's what I was going to say, a little research on splash pads and the amount of maintenance and stuff that it takes might be useful.
They did that. They actually
my question was the street crew brought into this? Like,
yes, the street crew guy was sitting there, the head of it all. And the way they're going to do it, they're doing a splash pad that does not require chemicals. So it's 50,000 gallons a day when it's running, that goes right into the sewer, but it's not treated water, and it's better for the environment. It's there's so much repair on splash pads that have chemicals. And then you go back to get a part that's broken and they don't make it anymore, and it's only like a 10-year-old splash pad, you know, like these are real things. So my question to you is how to bring that objection who to bring it to first, and then how might, because I'm bringing Sociocracy. I'm actually working with Ted now, not with Sociocracy for All, but I want to meet with you and Ted Rao, yes, and
Yes, love them.
right, and
Okay.
so I'm totally about what this everything. My nonprofit is all of this. We're restructuring because of this, because so how do I start the process where I can build these networks of sociocracy? Like, I see this as an opportunity for me, but I just don't know the first step to start setting up. You know, can we, you know, like that came up last night, that people were saying, oh, you're hiding the cost of this and we're all going to have to pay for it. And I mean, it was so sneaky. So many people were so untrusting. I mean, here they are, they're bringing the proposal forward to hear the objections. That's why you propose something to the community.
Right.
People are accusing them of being sneaky. And I mean, how to get,
well, it is hard for people to trust a proposal.
Yeah.
It's being brought, even if it's being brought, like it's charrette and we want to get your feedback so we can adapt it. We've been wounded so many times where it's like, y'all have already decided. And this is just checking a box.
Yeah.
And we don't trust that you haven't already made your decision and going to do what you're going to do. And we don't really have any power. I live in a historically Black neighborhood, been hearing that my whole life. I mean, my whole time here.
Yeah.
And I was very naive. I was like, because I'm like, I could call anybody on the city and get an appointment if I wanted to. And I was like, oh yeah, there's people who can't have that, who don't live in that world. So that was, my white liberal wake up. But so that's legit, right? And that's what folks, and so some empathy for the folks who were bringing the proposal, like what you're seeing is people don't trust you. Right. So that, like, just naming very, like what you're seeing, it doesn't mean you're not trustworthy. There's just trust is built one decision at a time, and we don't trust you. Like, you're not trusted around this. Also, the work that you've done so far has not, this is the thing about cities, particularly, they do all the planning they bring people in too late.
Yes, I know that.
People should bring the community in at the design level from the very beginning. In fact, get them to help you say, what is success? What do we want to learn? And what is success? I'm going to give you participatory evaluation is one of the things that we are bringing in more. Is like bringing the folks that you're designing for into the designing process, right? Bring people in sooner before you get, and if there's a barrier to that, figure out how to break that barrier down. Like, that's what, so there's that. And then that would have been the design crew of because the purpose is what? To get more water experience for kids, right?
Right.
In an affordable way.
Keep the trees.
Right. The purpose is not a splash pad. The purpose is water and fun experiences for kids in the summertime that are safe and, low maintenance or whatever.
Right.
And gonna last. Like, what are the other criteria? Lasting a long time, resilient,
maintenance,
repairable,
less maintenance,
budget to maintain. All those things. So
keeping the green
space. I have a next step for you particularly, but
I see it as an opportunity to educate on what these trees are in our community. I even want to put name them Benny, George, whatever. So they have this, so we start to recognize them as a being that, is the,
you're not going to get that
in themselves.
You're trying to change people's belief system.
I know, that's right. So I don't want to
leave people
write
behind.
the letter to the editor without going to my village trustees first.
I think the criteria really
The what?
making public the need for criteria and the kind of criteria that you're suggesting to
Yeah.
shift that conversation, and that keeping the park green is part of that. So the trees are part of that. You don't want to lose that value,
Right.
but
And
you do want to have the kids have a place to play with water in the summertime, and then all these other criteria, and nudge them to rethink all around those criteria, so that they're getting these benefits that
Yeah.
the criteria offer them,
right.
as a way of rethinking how, where, and how to do that project, if indeed that project is what they come up with in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the shade and the habitat and the beauty and the value of the park, like you can never get those trees back.
I know.
You
Yeah.
know, those trees will never be back. And like there's
the
just
green-
enough objection in our community for cutting down those trees that the tree should be off the table. Because there's just enough
Well,
objection.
you want the
And-
water
and-
feature to go ahead without those objections, instead of those objections impacting the water feature.
Yes.
So keep the trees so that you can, don't worry, move around that. You've got lots of other spaces, other ways to do it. So don't create more trouble for yourself by throwing the trees in there.
What was that last part?
By throwing the trees. I mean, why bring up the trees? Because people are going to object to that. It's going to be it's a diversion from putting the water feature in, or whatever.
I don't
you
know.
do.
I'm saying
Oh, yeah.
the objection, there are enough people in your community who object to getting rid of the trees.
Right.
Council member, decision maker.
It's going to slow down that project.
There are enough people that you can vote over us and do this anyway. And here's what it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
Here's what it's going to cost you to take those trees, because there's enough of us who object. And this winner take all voting, being voted over, if 51% of the people who actually vote say go ahead, you're going to have, that's going to, you're breaking all the trust. And it's like, like there's enough people who object to getting rid of these trees, to object to sacrificing these trees, that you need to take that possibility just off the table and say what we need, like what we want is a water feature for our kids that we can afford.
Yep.
The limits to that are not pool or splash pad. Those are not our only two strategies for getting water experiences for our kids.
And those are kind of private conversations you can have with all of the decision makers at every level. And then
that's a lot of time. See, it's exhausting.
Time.
It's exhausting, and it's meant to be exhausting, and it's meant to leave you out. It's a system that's actually meant to leave out your voice, but while gaslighting you into thinking that your voice is being included, because you voted for representatives, and now they're going to do what they're going to do. And they're making all these, and they're appointing all the people, the staff who are doing the work. And those people it's designed to actually, it's designed to leave you out.
To eliminate my objection.
It's designed to not give you a voice while gaslighting you into thinking you have one. I think. I mean, that's where I'm at in 2023.
Yeah, I don't think it was intended that way. When it first came up, we were fewer.
You know what?
It was much easier. We did have these conversations before.
They were all white men who went to the same schools. How many different perspectives were they going to have?
Well, and there were public conversations and stuff, which we don't do anymore.
They
used to meet in the town square. They would read the newspaper. They would talk, and you would get.
It used to be called clutching. There's a term for. Let's do some coffee clutching.
Yeah.
I got to bring that back in my little community, because
that's a great idea.
People remember coffee clutching.
Yeah.
And,
There's a great facilitation method called dynamic facilitation. You can look it up. It's online. where it's a great way to, like, maybe, it's a great process for bringing all those voices into a room and like it's kind of everybody has to listen to each other kind of voice because of the way it's facilitated.
Yeah, I used to do feature searches for just that reason. Because it's a 2 or 3 day process. You bring everybody in, everybody hears from everybody, you begin to respect everybody, you create a shared understanding of direction of what you want to do, and then you actually do plans, and you create teams that are going to work together. So, yeah.
And then in the end, it's still you're doing plans where people are in consent, right? We're not just leaving people out and telling them they have to suck it up. People don't suck it up. They don't. Not for long.
Yep.
And
yeah, well, we're certainly seeing the response of people who have sucked it up for a long time and now are not willing to do that anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the whole situation is in our country, is that people did suck it up, were told they should suck it up, and then somebody said, oh, you don't have to.
but trying to
not, but they don't know what to do about that. They don't know how to get back in engagement. Right. They're still using the same old thing. Well, you got your way, now I want mine.
And here's another thing about a culture of consent. I'm sorry, Catherine, I get excited.
No, it's okay.
Here's another thing about a culture of consent. You don't have to defend your objection. You have to say it has to be an objection within, we're not going to achieve our shared purpose, or I can't fulfill my role. Like that's really an
where there's a risk.
The risk is I can't fulfill my role, or we will fail in our purpose, our shared purpose. Right? So that's the risk. So if the shared purpose, like I would even do maybe a reframe that the shared purpose is a beautiful park and a water experience for our kids. Right? The purpose is not a splash pad. That's just a strategy. So where was I going with this? Oh, you may want the trees to stay because they are sacred beings. Somebody else may want the trees to stay because they create cooling in a heating up planet. And they like the habitat and they're beautiful and they're traditional and they just have nostalgia for them. But you don't have to defend your objection. You have to be able to state it. Like you have to be able, in sociocracy, you do need to be able to express you can't just be secret. Like, I just don't like it. You do have to say, these are the risks that you're going to break trust because there's people who care about those trees and want them. You're going to there's a huge risk that this splash pad is going to, be broken in 5 or 10 years and have been a waste of our money and hard to maintain. You can bring in evidence for that. There's a risk that, that the park will never be the same. It will, now it's just going to be a hot place and people will stop coming. Like these are, there's a risk that you will break trust. Like you will create people will stop to trust you as representatives. Like I can talk about those risks. I don't have to convince anybody else that in a consent culture, you don't have to believe me that shade is important to the park. In a consent culture, it's enough for us to say, you know what, there's enough of us.
Right.
There's somebody who thinks that's important. So you get that. But to try to bring any of that in, like, I guess speak to the risks of the purpose, not to the risks of your own heartbreak. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I've just kept y'all so long.
No, I have.
Well,
thank you.
Yes, I really appreciate it, Michelle. You've been wonderful. Just wonderful.
Oh,
yeah.
Well,
really
it was
good.
my pleasure.
Really
I
good.
can talk about this stuff all day long.
So this will be on the network. We will put it up under Inspiring Interviews. So it will be there. And I will also put it on my YouTube channel. So it's available to the general public as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let
Yeah.
me, I'll just send you those links.
Okay. And I'll put them in the description.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. That'll
Yeah.
work. Just send you
Yeah.
the links to those and.
Yeah. So
All right.
thank you very much. And we'll have a new person next month. So my hope is to do these on the fourth Thursday of every month. We will have somebody. And I'm looking, so it'll be somebody new and interesting, I'm hoping.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Peggy.
it
It's good
all.
to meet you.
Thank you, Michelle, very much.
Best of luck. Like I'll be lifting up, all the
Yeah.
prayers for your work.
Thank
Where,
you.
where do you live?
Kewaskum, Wisconsin, so an hour north of Milwaukee.
Okay. Well, take care.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.